Let me know where you're tuning in from. Your insights shape this journey. Every message from you adds to the mystery. Holmes and I had spent a quiet day, the kind that stirred a curious restlessness in my friend, having just concluded the affair of the Hungarian cabinet cipher. Matter which, owing to certain diplomatic sensitivities, I am constrained from detailing. Holmes had retreated into a period of brooding introspection. The fire burned low in the grate. His violin lay untouched by the window, and the afternoon's Post sat unopened upon the side table. I had begun reading The Martyrdom of Man in an effort to engage Holmes in debate, knowing how his scientific rigor took issue with its sweeping generalizations, but even Buckle failed to rouse him. It was nearly 7:30 when the doorbell rang with a peculiar urgency. Mrs. Hudson's soft footsteps could be heard on the stairs, followed by the murmur of conversation. A moment later she entered with a look of both curiosity and concern. Holmes glanced up at me briefly, then turned his gaze toward the fire. "Show him in," he said simply. The visitor who stepped into our rooms was a tall, ascetic man in his early 60s, impeccably dressed, but visibly shaken. His silver hair had been combed back with meticulous care, though a slight tremor in his hand betrayed his composure. A musician's long fingers curled nervously around the brim of his hat. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice a cultured tenor tinged with a foreign accent. "I beg your pardon for arriving unannounced. I am Maestro Yellow Violinist, conductor of the Royal Philharmonic Society and musical director at the Hanover Rooms." Holmes inclined his head. "I am acquainted with your reputation, sir. You conducted the Brahms Festival at St. James's last spring, did you not? I recall your tempi were the subject of much divided opinion." Vaughn allowed a wan smile. "Quite so. And yet it is not tempo but silence, which now haunts me." He seated himself, placing his hat carefully beside him. "It concerns a man named Luca Virelli, an Italian violinist of rare talent, gifted, temperamental, and, now, I fear, either mad or murdered." This pronouncement seized even Holmes' attention. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "Go on." "Luca Virelli was to have performed tonight," said Vaughn. "A solo recital at the Hanover Rooms. The program had been widely advertised, Paganini, Bach, and a new composition of his own. At precisely 8 o'clock, the audience assembled. I was backstage. We waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. No Virelli. You presumed he was delayed?" "Asked." "We did, until the theater's stage manager received a sealed envelope, delivered by a boy in livery. Inside was a single sheet of music paper. On it, 5 notes scrawled in Virelli's handwriting, with a phrase, 'I have played my final adagio.' Suicidal?" Holmes asked. "That was our fear." I left the hall at once and proceeded to Virelli's lodgings in Golden Square. He was not there. His landlady had not seen him since the previous afternoon. Worse still, his prized violin, a 1716 Stradivarius painted in an unmistakable yellow lacquer, was gone. No sign of forced entry. No note. Nothing. Holmes rose and paced slowly toward the window. "And what does Scotland Yard make of the affair?" "I spoke to Inspector Lestrade not an hour ago. He dismissed it as the antics of an eccentric artist. Suggested Virelli had taken a sudden fit of nerves. But that is impossible. Luca was proud, arrogant even, but afraid of an audience. Never." Holmes turned back to him, his eyes gleaming. "A yellow violin, a vanished artist, and a cryptic musical phrase. Curious indeed." He looked to me. "Watson, I believe this may warrant a late stroll. Golden Square. I think in the lodgings of Signor Virelli." Vaughn rose with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I can only hope you find him alive." Holmes smiled faintly. "Hope, Maestro, is the overture. What we seek is the theme beneath the noise, the hidden melody." And with that, the game was afoot. The hansom cab rattled through the misted streets as Holmes and I made our way toward Golden Square. The damp air carried with it the faint tang of coal smoke and wet stone. mingled with the far-off cries of newspaper vendors hawking the evening edition. Beside me, Holmes sat with his chin tucked deep into the folds of his greatcoat, his eyes narrowed not in fatigue but in that peculiar state of concentrated detachment he had learned to recognize. When he was thus, it was as though all the noise and blur of London dissolved around him, leaving only the cold clarity of pure thought. 5 notes, he murmured suddenly, as though responding to a question I had not asked. Volin said they were written in Varelli's hand. Indeed. On music paper. Do you recall the notes? I'm afraid not, I admitted. Maestro Volin did not describe them specifically. Holmes gave a small grunt of displeasure. Then we must obtain that sheet. Music is a language, structured, deliberate. 5 notes may convey more than 100 words. To those who understand, he fell silent again, save for the occasional click of his fingernails against the ivory head of his cane. The fog grew thicker as we approached Soho, curling in ghostly tendrils along the base of the buildings. At last the cab pulled up in Golden Square, a dim and rather weary-looking enclave with narrow-bowed houses whose windows flickered with gaslight like tired eyes blinking against the dark. Volin had given us the address, No. 3, a narrow 3-storied Georgian house, wedged between a pawnbroker's and an office of Italian shipping agents. Holmes knocked thrice, sharply, and after a moment the door creaked open to reveal a woman of stout proportions in a frayed lace cap and apron. Her eyes, red-rimmed and watchful, darted from Holmes to me and back again. "We've come regarding Mr. Luca Virelli," Holmes said without preamble, flashing a card. "He is, I understand, a lodger here." The woman nodded cautiously. "He was, sir, but he ain't come home since yesterday. I'm Mrs. Thistle, the landlady." Holmes handed her the card. "We may wish to look at his room." She hesitated, fingers clutching the doorknob like a ship's rail. I told the inspector what I knew. Mr. Virelli was a strange one. Loud when he played, quiet when he weren't. Came and went all odd hours, but he paid regular, and I don't ask questions of gentlemen who pay. "Very commendable," said Holmes, with a faint edge. "And the key?" She handed it over reluctantly and led us up 2 flights of stairs, her thick-soled boots thudding on the wooden steps. The corridor at the top smelled of varnish and stale air. She pointed to a door at the far end, 3rd floor, end of the hall. We waited until she had withdrawn. Then Holmes inserted the key and pushed open the door. The room within was small, but tidy. A worn carpet covered the creaking floorboards. The bed was made, the coverlet smooth. A music stand stood near the window, facing a small armchair, and beside it, a cracked porcelain basin and pitcher. Everything had the orderly staidness of a space recently inhabited, then suddenly abandoned. Holmes stepped inside and began his examination with swift efficiency. He moved like a hound on a scent, running his fingers along the windowsill, checking the latch, lifting the lid of the writing desk. I busied myself with the mantelpiece, noting a row of violin rosin blocks, a small oil lamp, and an ashtray containing 2 cigarette stubs. "Turkish blend," I said, examining one. "Rather pungent." "Indeed," Holmes replied, now crouching near the bedside table. "Virelli preferred Virginians. This is not his tobacco." A few moments later he rose with a folded scrap of paper in his hand. "And here, Watson, is our missing composition." He handed it to me, and I saw it was indeed music paper. 5 notes drawn in a slanted but graceful hand. E, G, D, set B, F. Above them, scrawled in the same ink, was the phrase, "I have played my final adagio." I stared at it, baffled. Could it be a signature of some kind? A farewell? Holmes took the page back, his eyes narrowing. The notes form no recognizable melody. But, see the intervals? E to G, a minor 3rd, D Jack to B, again a descending major 6. Curious. He set it down and turned his attention to the writing desk. Inside were several sheets of music, most half-finished. A few were scrawled with annotations in Italian. Furioso, dolce, sottovoce. Nothing struck me as unusual until Holmes paused over one page and frowned. "Look here," he said. "This movement is titled Il Silenzio di Giada, the Silence of Jade. A curious title." He flipped to another. Il Giuramento dell'Ombra, the Oath of the Shadow. "These are not compositions for concert," he said slowly. "They are coded messages. Are you suggesting Varelli was involved in espionage?" Holmes tapped his fingers against his lips. It would not be the first time a musician concealed messages in a score. Music has both structure and ambiguity. It lends itself well to concealment. He moved to the wardrobe and flung it open. Several suits hung inside, one of them a dark frock coat with a faint sheen of stage powder. Holmes reached into the inner breast pocket and drew out a folded telegram. He read it quickly, then passed it to me. "Arrival confirmed. Package will be ready at midnight. Ensure no delay." There was no address, no signature beyond that single letter. But Holmes's expression had changed. He was animated now, the lines around his mouth drawn tight with interest. "I believe, Watson, we are no longer dealing merely with a vanished violinist. This telegram confirms a transaction of what nature? We must yet discover, but note the phrasing, package, midnight, and the command to avoid delay. This reeks of subterfuge." I looked at the room anew. It no longer seemed tidy, but staged, too orderly. A silence too deliberate. "Do you suppose he fled?" I asked. Holmes was at the window, unfastening the latch. "No, I suspect he was taken or lured by someone he trusted, someone he expected to meet. And it was not from this room." He pointed to the sill. Dust undisturbed. No footprints. The front door, then. Holmes turned. "We must trace the messenger who delivered the note at the theater. Volin said he was a boy in livery. There can't be many such in service tonight. We'll begin at the Hanover rooms and I will speak to the doorman myself. And the telegram? I shall entrust it to Lestrade. A minor gamble, but one that may rattle the cage. Meanwhile," he stopped. Brow furrowed. From beneath the wardrobe, he had spied something. Kneeling, he reached and drew out a single yellow violin string, frayed at one end. It was looped, as though it had been tied hastily around something small. He held it up to the light. "The last note Varelli played," he murmured. "But not, I think, his final one." We departed the lodgings without further word. Our minds waited with uncertainty. Somewhere in the grey labyrinth of London, a master violinist had disappeared. But whether he had gone of his own accord or been silenced, like the still air in his empty room, we had yet to determine. Holmes, however, seemed almost to welcome the obscurity. For him, mystery was music, and each silence held the promise of a hidden harmony. Our return to the Hanover rooms was swift, for Holmes remained keenly aware that in matters such as these, each moment squandered was an opportunity lost. The fog, ever denser now, rolled like sea broom through the lamplight, rendering the familiar streets oddly distorted and uncertain, as though London herself were conspiring to conceal whatever lay at the heart of this affair. The Hanover rooms, when we arrived, presented a rather sullen spectacle. The crowd had long since dispersed, and the glow from the lobby had dimmed to a tired hush. Only the box office manager and a lone porter remained visible through the paneled doors, engaged in low conversation. Holmes entered without hesitation and addressed the latter, a burly, pale-eyed fellow in a stiff collar, who looked up with wary surprise. "We seek information regarding a boy who delivered a note here earlier this evening," Holmes said, drawing the man's attention with the quiet authority that often made officials, however indifferent, snap to regard. He was in livery, presumably from a messenger service. The porter rubbed his chin. "Yes, sir. Came just after 8, he did. Handed it straight to Mr. Delby, stage manager. That is, and said it was urgent. Young lad, not more than 14. Had a cap and brass buttons, smart-like, from the Graysons outfit, I believe." "Graysons," Holmes repeated. "Excellent. That narrows the field. Do you recall which direction he went?" "South, toward the Strand. I'd bet he was bound for Charing Cross or thereabouts." Holmes thanked him and turned to me as we stepped outside. Grayson's is one of 3 firms that still employs uniformed boys. They're reliable, often contracted by banks, but also used cleverly by those who wish a message to appear official. In due time, he said. But first, a thought experiment, Watson. Suppose you wish to vanish from public life without arousing immediate suspicion. You are well known in musical circles, temperamental, prone to artistic drama. What is the cleanest method? Feign a breakdown, I offered. Indeed. And better still, stage a cryptic, melancholic disappearance. Deliver a symbolic message. Allow the world to interpret the absence as a suicide. The stage is prepared, the spotlight dies, and you are gone. But why vanish at all? I asked. That, Holmes said with a glint in his eye, is the precise question. Let us suppose Virelli intended to disappear for a reason not of vanity, but necessity. Someone expected him, someone with influence or power, and perhaps not merely to applaud his talent. We turned eastward on foot, avoiding the crush of carriages, Holmes moving at a brisk clip. We arrived at Grayson's within the half hour, a well-maintained establishment tucked near a row of solicitor offices. The door bore an etched glass sign, Grayson and Sons, discreet messengers. Since I require the identity of a messenger boy who delivered a note to the Hanover rooms shortly after 8 o'clock this evening, Holmes said, drawing forth his card and placing it squarely on the counter. Sherlock Holmes, the matter concerns a possible disappearance. The name worked its usual spell. The clerk, who had clearly heard of my companion, straightened and reached for a brass-bound logbook. Yes, sir, yes. That would be young Thomas Ellicott. He returned at 8:45, said the job was done, nothing out of the ordinary. May we speak with him? He'll be in the dormitory upstairs. I'll fetch him directly. Moments later, a wiry lad with sandy hair and an anxious air was brought down. He removed his cap at once upon seeing Holmes. You delivered a note to the Hanover rooms this evening? Holmes asked gently. Yes, sir. Handed it to the stage manager, just like I was told. Who gave it to you? The boy blinked. Gentes looked Italian. Mustache, long coat. He was waiting outside our side door before I'd even taken off my bag. Said he needed it rushed to the Hanover. No delays. Paid extra. 2 bob. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Did he give a name? No, sir, but he had a foreign accent. Not like the Frenchies, thicker. He called me Garzon, I think. Would you recognize him again? I think so, sir. Tall, thin face. Had a yellow scarf, I remember that. Holmes nodded slowly. That will suffice. Thank you, Thomas. You've been most helpful. Back outside. Holmes lit a cigarette and exhaled with audible satisfaction. There, Watson, we meet our first shadow. An unknown man, Italian in appearance, sufficiently urgent to overpay for swift delivery, and he ensured the message bore all the hallmarks of a personal farewell. This is no coincidence. We stood for a moment in the fog, the gaslight painting long shadows across the pavement. There is another point, Holmes continued. Valezin's presence tonight was significant. He was not merely concerned as a colleague. I suspect a prior arrangement between him and Virelli, one that may have soured. You suspect Volin of misdirection, possibly, or he is being manipulated as well. In either case, we need information, personal letters, rivalries, financial dealings. I intend to pay a visit to Virelli's publisher in the morning, but tonight we shall go to the theater again. The Hanover room. No, he said. To Covent Garden. I stared at him. Why? Covent Garden. Because, he said, tapping ash from his cigarette, it is where Signor Virelli was last seen in public before vanishing. Apart from his rehearsals, he dined there 2 nights ago with an unknown companion, so said the newspaper's society column, and more tellingly, he visited an antique shop on Drury Lane shortly thereafter. I blinked. How in the world do you know that? Holmes smiled faintly. I saw the trace of red sealing wax on one of the scraps in his writing desk, the sort used by Broderick's Antiquities. an old firm on Drury Lane. They seal all purchases with a wax stamp, and you deduce that from a fragment. A fragment, Watson, is all I require when it is peculiar enough. And so we went, cutting again through the shadows of London, to Broderick's, a dimly lit trove of curiosities, where time itself seemed packed onto every shelf. The proprietor, a bald-headed man with pince-nez, greeted us with unfeigned surprise when Holmes introduced himself. "Ah, Mr. Holmes. Yes, I remember the violinist. Quite intense. That fellow bought something unusual. What was it?" The man hesitated. "A small brass key. Very old. Baroque in style. Said it belonged to a cabinet made in Cremona." Holmes raised a brow. "Did he say where the cabinet was?" "No. Only that he needed the key urgently. Paid in guineas, not shillings. Very particular. He seemed uneasy." Holmes thanked him, then stepped outside into the street with the expression of a man who has just heard a long-awaited overture begin. A key to something old. Cremona. Cremona, Watson, is not only the birthplace of Stradivari, but a known center for encrypted mechanical instruments, hidden compartments in musical furniture. Our mystery deepened, and the yellow violin. "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "we are being told a story in symbols. A yellow violin, a missing key, and 5 musical notes, all part of a coded performance." He fell silent, listening, as if the very air carried some vibration he alone could perceive. At last, he turned to me. "We shall speak with Lestrade in the morning, and then into the music." By the time we returned to Baker Street, the bells of St. Mary le Strand had already struck midnight. Holmes, though visibly wearied by the day's exertions, showed no inclination toward rest. Instead, he set about clearing a space on the sitting-room table, arranging our gather evidence with surgical precision. The telegram found in Varelli's coat, the sheet of music bearing the cryptic 5-note signature, and the yellow violin string. He studied them as one might study chess pieces before the final stage of a complex endgame. I poured us both a measure of brandy, which Holmes accepted without comment, his mind turning over unseen gears. "The key purchased at Broderick's," he murmured, "was no trinket. Baroque in design, and tied, at least in Varelli's mind, to a Cremonese cabinet. There is meaning here, Watson. Meaning nested in craftsmanship. I suspect our vanished violinist was less concerned with performance than possession." He tapped the folded telegram. "And this package, ready by midnight? We missed it by less than an hour. I wonder, was the package musical, mechanical, or mortal? You believe someone else came into possession of it?" I asked. Holmes gave a brief nod. "That much is likely. What concerns me is who retrieved it, and whether Varelli was betrayed or complicit. But let us not theorize in a vacuum. We shall visit Scotland Yard in the morning. Lestrade may already have uncovered something useful, though I dare say he will not realize its value." He retired then for a scant few hours' rest, but I lay awake for some time, listening to the city's nocturnal hum through the fog-muted glass. The phrase, "I have played my final adagio," echoed again and again in my thoughts, not as a statement of despair, but as a curtain line, the calculated exit of a man accustomed to dramatic gestures. The following morning broke gray and cold. Holmes was up and dressed before I had left my bed, and by 8:30 we were seated in a rattling cab once more, bound for Scotland Yard. Inspector Lestrade met us in his cramped office, with a mixture of habitual irritation and wary respect. He gestured for us to sit. "Well, Holmes, I suppose you're here about your missing fiddler. Bit of a tempest in a teapot, if you ask me. No body, no crime." Holmes smiled faintly. "One might say the same of arsenic." Lestrade snorted. "Your man may have simply skipped town. Artists do that, especially foreign ones. But I did make inquiries, as promised. Nothing conclusive, though one item may interest you." He handed over a folded report. Holmes read it in silence. I leaned forward to catch a glimpse. It concerned the recovery, in Paddington Station, of a violin case, unattended, left on a bench in the gentleman's waiting room. at precisely 12:20 in the morning. The constable on duty, seeing it untouched for half an hour, had opened it. Inside, a yellow lacquered violin, resting on blue velvet. There was no bow, no tag, and strangely, no strings. Holmes handed the report to me without a word. No strings, I repeated aloud. Yet the instrument is unmistakably Varelli's. Indeed, Holmes replied, and left at a station, Paddington, westward travel. Curious, Lestrade leaned back. The instrument's at the yard now. I can show it to you. We followed him through the labyrinthine halls to an evidence room where the violin case had been secured. Lestrade opened it with a flourish, and Holmes stepped forward with an almost reverent motion. The instrument within was beautiful, clearly antique, its yellow varnish catching the light like trapped sunshine. But as reported, the strings were missing, the bridge removed, and the tailpiece slightly misaligned. Holmes frowned, an attempt to render it unplayable or to conceal something. He turned the instrument over, examining the scroll and pegs. Then, with a delicate motion, he tapped the body and listened, his ear tilted close to the fifth holes, and then he gave a soft, satisfied breath. "Watson, your penknife, if you please." I handed it over. Holmes inserted the tip carefully beneath the tailpiece, levering it up without damaging the wood. A soft click followed. From the cavity beneath, he drew a folded scrap of parchment, brown and brittle with age, no larger than a playing card. Holmes unfolded it, revealing a faded diagram, intricate and spidery. It was covered in Italian script, musical notation, and at the top, a single phrase, "Il cuore di Stradivari," the heart of Stradivari. Lestrade leaned over. Some kind of plan. A map, perhaps. Holmes murmured. Or a cipher. Look here. These are not mere musical notes. They correspond to positions, columns, and rows. A musical coordinate system. I've seen this before in the affair of the Genoese bell. He folded the parchment again and replaced it carefully in his breast pocket. This confirms one thing at least. Varelli's violin was not only an instrument, it was a repository. For what? I asked. For knowledge. Secrets. Perhaps a key to a lost work, or the location of a hidden chamber. Something tied to Stradivari's legacy. Varelli wasn't just a musician. He was a guardian, or a thief. Lestrade frowned. You believe there's more to this than music? I believe music was only the first veil, Holmes said. The second is now before us. Outside. The city bustled as usual, oblivious to the possibility that a centuries-old secret had ridden unnoticed on the 12:20 from Paddington. Holmes stood on the steps of Scotland Yard, breathing in the cold air. We must find out who else knew of that parchment, he said. Varelli could not have planned this alone. There's someone, perhaps the Italian with the yellow scarf, who guided, financed, or threatened him. And I suspect we've not yet heard the last of Maestro Volin. You suspect him still? I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. He concealed something, he said at last. He chose his words carefully. That is always telling. When a man claims to fear a suicide, but cannot describe the emotional condition of the one he fears for, you may be certain he fears something else entirely. We returned to Baker Street, and after a modest luncheon, Holmes spent an hour examining the parchment under his lens. He made several tracings, muttered to himself, and occasionally drew faint lines in pencil upon a blank sheet. At last he said, "The cipher is musical, yes, but also geographical. The pattern suggests cardinal movement, steps, not notes. And there's something else, a phrase repeated 3 times. Sotto la nota perduta. Beneath the lost note." What could it mean? It means, he said slowly, that the key Varelli purchased was not for an object but for a location, a place where a note once existed and no longer does. He stood abruptly. "Watson, fetch your coat. We're going to the National Library." The library? For a lost note? Holmes smiled, his eyes suddenly alight. Yes, because if one wishes to find something hidden in music, one must look where music has already been found and forgotten. Holmes hailed a cab with a sharp whistle, and within minutes we were rattling northward toward the National Library, the parchment safely tucked within Holmes's pocket, like a fragment of buried treasure. The rain had begun again, a soft, steady misting that drew the color from the streets and turned London into a study in gray. Holmes, however, seemed utterly untouched by the weather or the hour. He sat forward in the seat, his hands steepled beneath his chin, eyes alight with a peculiar gleam. I had come to know well the flash of a mind closing in on a hidden truth. "Do you recall, Watson," he said without turning his gaze from the street, "a certain minor case from 2 years past? The matter of the Lisbon Sonata." I blinked. "You mean the one with the forged manuscript? The baritone who had hidden a confession between staves of a Schumann lied?" "Precisely. There is a precedent in that affair for what we now pursue. Music used not as expression, but concealment, and in this case the phrase beneath the lost note intrigues me deeply. It implies omission, something once written but deliberately removed. Lost to who? To history, perhaps, or to the average eye, but not, I think, to Signor Virelli. We arrived at the library shortly thereafter. Its vast stone edifice loomed above the street like a silent temple of knowledge. Within, it was hushed and cool, the air laced with the must of ancient paper and polished wood. Holmes led the way up to the music archives with brisk authority, bypassing the inquiries desk with a nod to the startled clerk who rose at our entry. "I require access to your 18th century manuscript collection," he informed the archivist, a pale young man with ink-stained fingers and a startled expression. "Specifically, any surviving scores attributed to or copied from the Cremonese school, Stradivari, Guarneri, any lesser-known composers affiliated with them." The man blinked, then nodded hurriedly. "Why, yes, sir. That would be the Dunning Index. We have several references to Stradivari, but of course he was primarily a luthier, not a composer." "Even so," Holmes said sharply, "let us see them." Within 15 minutes we were seated at a long wooden table, before us a stack of folios bound in parchment, many bearing marginalia in Latin or Italian. Holmes turned the pages with care, scanning quickly, occasionally tapping a finger when he encountered a peculiar signature or a discrepancy in the bar lines. I watched in silence, unable to divine what, if anything, he saw within the dusty notation. Then he stopped. Slowly, he laid one page flat and studied it with narrowed eyes. "Here," he said, "Sonata a tre in sol minore, attributa a Paggi d'Agnelli, circa 1720. Note the dedication, Al cuore di Stradivari." I leaned over. The piece was in G minor, marked andante sostenuto, and appeared at first glance unremarkable. But Holmes was examining a specific measure near the center of the second movement. "This is the point," he murmured. "The fifth bar after the second repeat, a measure that should by the surrounding structure contain a descending line in thirds, but it does not. The phrase breaks, unresolved." He tapped it again. "That, Watson, is the lost note. But why omit it? To create a reference point. To mark a location within the composition. Now, consider the parchment we recovered from Virelli's violin. If my theory is correct, it overlays this composition. It points not to sound, but to silence. From his coat pocket he produced the tracing he had made, carefully aligned it over the page, and tilted it to the light. The parchment's markings, rows of symbols and pitch letters fell precisely over the measure in question. Several of the coordinates aligned with measure numbers and rests. Holmes muttered softly, "Here, measure 42, column F. The word giada, jade, appears next to a rest symbol, and again, ombra, shadow, appears in a footnote near the key signature. This is not composition, it is a ciphered map." "To what?" I asked, scarcely breathing. "To the contents of the missing cabinet, or perhaps to the location of it." He sat back, eyes distant. "Watson, we must speak again to Maestro Violin." He knew far more than he confessed. I believe he was the custodian of this manuscript, and that he feared what Virelli intended to do with it. You think he sabotaged the performance? I think, Holmes said, rising. He played his part as carefully as any conductor, keeping the audience from seeing behind the curtain. We departed the library as a bell rang out the hour. Holmes had gone entirely quiet, his long legs carrying him swiftly through the wet streets. At last he spoke again, not looking at me. Violin is the key, but he will not speak willingly. We must approach him indirectly. We will call upon a woman named Ada Rollins, a cellist of some repute and an acquaintance of Varelli's. She performed with him twice last winter, and I believe she was once engaged to a pupil of Violin's. How do you know that? I do read the Musical Times, Watson. We found Miss Rollins at her residence near Fitzroy Square, a modest but elegant flat, with a cello case standing like a sentinel in the corner of the drawing room. She received us with a cautious curiosity, her eyes sharp behind a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles. "Mr. Holmes," she said, after we introduced ourselves, "I wondered when someone might come asking after Luca. But I confess, I'm not surprised by his disappearance. That man carried secrets like other men carry knives." Holmes gave her a searching look. "You believe he planned it?" "I believe he feared something," she said. "He was brilliant, yes, but also paranoid. He believed he had uncovered a lost legacy, something tied to the great makers of Cremona. He told me once that music was only the skin of the truth." "And Violin?" Holmes asked quietly. "What is his role in all this?" She hesitated. "Violin was his teacher, once. Many years ago. He denied it later. Claimed Varelli was too proud to learn, but I think they shared something, knowledge, perhaps, or guilt. The last time I saw them together, Violin looked at Luca not with anger, but with fear." Holmes nodded slowly. "Miss Rollins, one final question. Did Varelli ever mention a location, a place where he intended to perform his final piece? Something private, off stage?" She paused, then walked to a small bureau and withdrew a letter. "He sent this to me a week ago. I hadn't the courage to open it. But if it helps..." Holmes opened the envelope. Inside, a single line. "If the adagio is interrupted, seek me where no echo answers." Holmes read it aloud, softly. "No echo," he murmured. "That is no metaphor, Watson. It is a place." He turned, fire in his eyes. "A place where sound dies. A crypt, a vault, no echo. The resonance is absorbed." He turned to Ada. "Miss Rollins, thank you. You have brought us closer to the final performance." We stepped into the night once more, and Holmes walked quickly, with purpose. "Come, Watson. We have one stop left before this fugue resolves. We must descend into silence." We took no cab this time. Holmes strode through the darkening London streets with the momentum of certainty, as though each step brought him nearer to the center of a great slow-turning wheel, whose spokes had only just begun to show themselves. I followed without question, though I had not yet divined our precise destination. Holmes, as ever, dispensed answers only when he deemed them ready to be heard. At length, we reached the junction of Fleet Street and Ludgate Hill, where the dome of St. Paul's loomed above us, like a silvered sentinel. Holmes paused before a gated path descending beneath the cathedral's flank. "Come, Watson," he said, producing a small key from his coat pocket. The same key, I realized, that he had retrieved from Broderick's earlier. "We go now to the crypt." "The cathedral's crypt?" I asked, startled. "You believe Varelli is hiding here?" "I believe he came here," Holmes replied. "At least once, and perhaps more. This, Watson, is one of the few places in London where the human voice finds no return. A space designed to absorb sound, to sanctify silence. The note that was lost, it was not in pitch alone. It was in resonance. The gate was unbarred. A custodian, recognizing Holmes from a prior acquaintance I had never learned of, admitted us with a wary glance and a candle lantern. "No one else down there, Mr. Holmes. Cathedral's closed. You'll have the place to yourselves, but don't tarry. Locks changed in an hour." Holmes inclined his head, then descended with the lantern in hand. The stone staircase spiraled into darkness. the air growing colder with each turn. When we reached the floor of the crypt, the candlelight cast long, fluid shadows along the carved sarcophagi. Names I had read in history books seemed to peer at us from marble and brass. Wren, Turner, Nelson. We moved carefully. Holmes held the lantern low, scanning every alcove and recess. He paused beside a carved arch bearing the Latin inscription, Resurgam. Here, he said. Note the configuration of the vaulting. It matches a diagram I saw upon Varelli's parchment. The tri-arched ceiling, the 3 descending steps. This was the location encoded in the cipher. I looked about, but the crypt was empty, save for the tombs and our own footsteps, swallowed swiftly by the walls. No sign of him, I whispered. Not yet, Holmes replied. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small tuning fork, which he struck lightly against the stone. The sound was faint, a pure E-flat. But unlike above ground, it produced no echo, no lingering vibration. The air seemed to drink the sound, like dry earth absorbs a drop of rain. Holmes nodded, as though this confirmed something. Then wordlessly he stepped behind a column and ran his fingers along the base. A soft click followed, and a portion of the stone panel gave way with a muted creak. It was a hidden recess, cleverly disguised within the ancient stonework. Inside we found a narrow wooden box, about 2 feet in length, and bound with twine. Holmes lifted it carefully, laid it atop a nearby stone bench, and untied the string. Within lay a second violin, aged, but plainly of masterful construction. Its varnish was darker than the first, a deep amber hue upon the inside rim. Barely visible in the light was a name carved with exquisite care. Antonio Stradivari. I drew a sharp breath. The original? I asked. Surely not. The twin, Holmes interrupted. Varelli's Yellow Violin was a decoy, a cover for this. And here, he lifted a small, velvet-wrapped bundle from beneath the instrument and unrolled it to reveal a letter and a folded document, brittle with age. Holmes scanned the letter first. From Stradivari himself, or rather a later owner, claiming provenance. He describes a secret registry, an archive of hidden instruments made not for courts or concert halls, but for private societies. An order of silence. An order. A patronage society. Holmes clarified. Wealthy men in 18th century Italy, obsessed with acoustics, secrecy, and control. They commissioned instruments capable of concealing mechanisms, tiny compartments, weighted strings, tone distorters. But more than that, these instruments were also keys. To what? To each other. To a network. A code. Varelli uncovered it, or part of it. That was his final adagio. Not a performance, but a revelation. And now, I asked, what becomes of this? Before Holmes could answer, a sound broke the hush. A soft shuffle of leather against stone. Holmes extinguished the lantern at once, plunging us into blackness. We crouched behind the sarcophagus as footsteps approached, measured, careful. Then a second set, lighter, 2 figures. I strained to listen. You are late, came a voice low, Italian, and unmistakably the same tone described by the Graysons' messenger boy. I needed confirmation, replied a second voice, closer, clipped, colder, Maestro Volin. I turned to Holmes in the darkness, but he motioned me to silence. It was here, the Italian murmured. I marked the alcove. You said there would be no delay, Volin replied. We were seen, the boy, the woman, Rollins. If Holmes has followed the trail, he cannot decode the second part without the instrument. And that is with me. A pause, then. Once I return to Milan, it will be done. No, you'll return nothing. The registry belongs to the society. And the violin? The Italian asked. Destroyed. Or displayed. I no longer care. There was the sound of shifting weight, perhaps the violin box being lifted. I felt Holmes tense beside me, then heard a sharp click, metal against stone. Put it down. Holmes's voice rang out, calm and unyielding. The beam of a small lantern flared in his hand, catching both men in its circle. The Italian, thin-faced with sharp features, froze where he stood. Violin turned slowly, his eyes unreadable. "So," Holmes said softly, "this was the last note, was it? A rendezvous between betrayal and ambition." Violin did not speak. "You used Varelli," Holmes continued. "Fed him just enough truth to awaken his curiosity, but not enough to control him. When he outpaced you, when he found the second violin, you planted the idea of a dramatic disappearance, a staged farewell, and you sent this man to collect the spoils." The Italian's hand moved subtly toward his pocket. Holmes shook his head. "Don't." There was silence. Then Violin said, "You cannot prove possession. You have no jurisdiction. Possession is not my goal," Holmes replied. "But knowledge, yes. And now the trail is clear. Scotland Yard awaits. I suggest you surrender with dignity." They hesitated. Then Violin stepped back, hands raised. The other followed suit, though his eyes remained fixed on the violin like a hawk unwilling to release its prey. Lestrade, who had been waiting just beyond the cathedral gates under Holmes's orders, entered moments later with 2 constables. The violin, the registry, and the 2 conspirators were secured, and within the hour the crypt fell silent once more. Outside, as dawn broke over the city's skyline, Holmes stood with me on the cathedral steps. The wind carried the scent of rain-washed stone and morning coal smoke. "Varelli?" I asked. "Gone," Holmes said, "but not dead. He will remain hidden. His part is played. Somewhere he listens, perhaps even now, to the echoes that never came." I glanced back at the sealed crypt entrance. "You've unraveled the score, Holmes. But tell me, do you believe music can truly carry such secrets?" He looked out toward the rising sun, then gave a soft smile. "Music, Watson, is mathematics cloaked in emotion. And what is a cipher, if not the same?" The morning wore on with a muted serenity, as though London herself were pausing to exhale after the long nocturnal tangle of intrigue we had just weathered. Holmes, as was his habit after such a climax, withdrew into a curious quietude, not out of fatigue, but from a private, inward reassembly of thoughts. He often likened it to returning instruments to their cases after a concert. Each must be cleaned, tuned, set down properly. The mind, too, required such order. But I, perhaps less disciplined in my temperament, could not so easily banish the unanswered questions that lingered like the trailing notes of Varelli's vanished violin. We had the instrument, the parchment, even the conspirators, but not the man himself, and without Luca Varelli, it seemed to me that something essential remained missing from the composition. Holmes had taken his usual position by the fire, cross-legged in the armchair with his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. I could see he was not done with the case, not in the deepest sense, and I said as much. "He still escapes us, Holmes." Holmes gave a slow nod without turning. "He does, and you're not satisfied." "I am never satisfied, Watson, with symmetry alone. A mystery can end neatly, and still not truthfully. The violin is accounted for, yes, the cipher decoded, the plot exposed, but the man, the performer at the heart of the drama, is still off stage. And yet," he turned to me at last, "I no longer believe he is merely hiding." I raised an eyebrow. "You think he's dead?" "No," Holmes said softly. "Worse, I think he has relinquished the performance entirely, that he has chosen silence not as refuge, but as conclusion." He rose and crossed to the window, where the fog had begun to thin. "It is not so much the absence of Varelli that troubles me. It is his orchestration. Every detail, Watson, the delivery of the note, the coded message, the misleading clues, all of it so carefully constructed. Yet there is one element that he could not control, and that is the man who sent the boy." "The Italian," I said. "The courier in the yellow scarf, precisely. He was Violin's man, not Varelli's. That was the dissonance in the harmony. Varelli staged a vanishing, yes, but he did not anticipate betrayal. He thought the music would end on his terms. And now, Holmes said, reaching for his coat. "We must find the final key. Not in London, but where the music began." I stood. "Cremona? No, that would be too obvious. Too far. No, this is closer." Miss Rollins once mentioned that Varelli had spent a great deal of time practicing not in his lodgings, but in a private hall, a disused conservatory in Hampstead, inherited from a late patron. I believe it is there we may yet find our soloist. Within the hour we were traveling by carriage to the northern heights, the streets gradually giving way to leafier roads and quieter facades. Hampstead, always something of a village within the city, had the peculiar stillness of a place suspended slightly above the ordinary noise of London. Holmes directed the driver to an address off Flask Walk, where a narrow lane wound its way between weathered stone walls. The building itself was modest, neoclassical in design, its windows long shuttered, the iron gate rusted at the hinges. Holmes pushed it open with some effort, and we passed into a courtyard choked with ivy and silence. At the back stood a tall set of oak doors. Holmes rapped twice. No answer. He tried the handle. It yielded. Inside, the air was dry with disuse, but not abandonment. A fine layer of dust lay on the floorboards, disturbed recently in one thin, deliberate trail. The main chamber was domed and echoless, its walls lined with faded acoustic panels. At the far end stood a music stand, an open case, and beside it a single chair. Holmes approached slowly. On the chair sat a folded garment, a well-worn concert coat, and atop the stand a bound manuscript. He opened it. The title page bore 5 words in Italian: L'adagio che finisce nel silenzio, the adagio that ends in silence. Holmes translated. He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. "It's written in Varelli's hand, and here several measures appear blank, but are not. Look, faint pencil marks later erased. Notation only visible at certain angles." He angled the page toward the light. I saw them too. Ghost notes, suggestions of phrases never fully committed to ink. Music that had merely existed. He meant it to be unfinished. Holmes murmured, or rather, unplayable. I glanced around the room. Then why come here at all? Holmes gestured toward the far wall. There, half hidden by a curtain, was a small alcove. We stepped through. It was a sleeping space, sparse, ascetic, a cot, a basin, a single shelf of books, and pinned to the wall above the cot, a photograph. Varelli, younger, smiling faintly beside a woman I did not recognize. Holmes stared at it for a long time. "I've seen her before," he said. Ada Rollins had a likeness on her mantle, though she never mentioned the name. His sister? Possibly. Or someone more complicated. He lifted a folded sheet from the shelf. It was a letter, unsigned, but unmistakably in Varelli's handwriting. "To those who seek the heart of music, know that it beats only in silence. What you call mystery was never mine to hold. I was merely its voice for a time. Now I leave the staff empty and the stage unlit. There is no encore." Holmes let the paper fall. "He's made his exit, Watson. Not in death, but in withdrawal. He has chosen the unheard over the heard. A final performance in private, unseen, unwitnessed. A vanishing not from the world, but from its attention." We stood there for some time, the quiet around us complete, unbroken even by breath. Then Holmes said, "Let us not disturb this place further. It is not a crime scene. It is a composition. And it ends here." We left the conservatory as the sun slipped behind the rooftops, and the shadows stretched like rests across the staves of the street. Holmes was silent for most of the journey back, but as we crossed the bridge into central London, he spoke once more. "Do you know, Watson, what separates genius from madness?" I shook my head. "Neither does the genius," he said. And then he smiled faintly, turned toward the window, and said nothing more until we reached Baker Street. We arrived back at Baker Street just as the lamps were being lit along the crescent. The evening was windless, the air sharp and dry, and for once London felt hushed in the manner of a theatre just before the curtain rises. Holmes was unusually subdued as we entered our rooms, his movements precise but drained of their usual energy, as though the resolution at the Hampstead Conservatory had stripped from him not the satisfaction of victory, but the essential friction that kept his mind in constant motion. He took his place at the fire, but did not reach for the violin or his pipe. Instead, he unfolded the letter from Varelli once more, and read it silently. The flames cast his face in flickering amber, and I noticed how his eyes did not linger on the words but seemed to study the space between them, as if searching for the echo of an unspoken phrase. "Holmes," I said at last, "we've found the violin. We've found the cipher, the registry, even the location where Varelli chose to vanish. Yet you are not satisfied." He looked up slowly. "No, Watson, because a mystery has two resolutions, one for the world and one for the man who created it. We may have solved the former, but the latter, that remains unfinished." I poured us both a measure of whiskey and waited. I knew from experience that Holmes did not speak merely to fill the silence. He spoke when something needed to be followed to its logical end, and not before. "Let us consider, Watson," he began after some time, "the sequence of events Varelli set into motion. He stages a disappearance. He leaves behind a coded message, one which he could not have been certain would fall into my hands. He deposits the yellow violin at Paddington, knowing full well it would be intercepted. He creates a false trail for his pursuers, but he also leaves behind the true Stradivarius, the hidden key, and a manuscript he labels the adagio that ends in silence." He paused. "And yet, he is not dead. There is no body, no suicide, no farewell spoken aloud to those closest to him. Only this quiet retreat, this unfinished act." I frowned. "You believe he wants to be found?" "I believe," Holmes said carefully, "that he wants someone to choose to find him, not by force but by understanding." "You mean this is a test?" "Not a test," Holmes said, "a finale. One written for a very specific audience." He reached into the drawer beside his chair and produced the small photograph from the conservatory, the one showing Varelli beside the unknown woman. "She is the final piece. You said she resembled someone." "More than resembled." Holmes laid the photograph beside the letter from Varelli and then brought over another. This, from an envelope I had not seen him receive. "Ada Rollins," he said, "taken 3 years ago. A concert program from Vienna, stored in the archives at the Royal Academy. Notice the tilt of the head, the way she places her hand on the cello. Now, compare." I looked. It was plain. The woman in both photographs was the same. The difference lay in time and circumstance, but the features were identical. "She lied," I said, astonished. "She said they were merely colleagues." "More than that," Holmes replied. "They were lovers, possibly even family. The bond is evident in the expression, hers as much as his. And yet she spoke of him only with distance, as though she had already mourned him." He stood abruptly and paced the room. "She directed us toward the crypt, Watson. Do you not see? She was not merely a source of information. She was guiding us through the composition. Each revelation, each step, was part of a preordained path. Varelli wanted us to find the registry. Violin was a necessary antagonist, but the real performance, his final adagio, was not for us. It was for her." "And yet," I said, "he sent the letter to her before he vanished. He asked her to seek him where no echo answers. That's where we went." Holmes stopped and turned sharply. "No, Watson, that's where we went, because she already had, likely more than once. The conservatory was not a place of retreat. It was a rehearsal space, a private hall. The real disappearance happened elsewhere." He returned to the table and laid down a map of the city. "Let us trace this one final time. He disappears before the performance, leaves behind a symbolic note. A decoy violin is left at a public station. The real instrument and a cryptic manuscript are hidden in a chapel beneath St. Paul's. Why there? Because he knew Violin would try to intercept it, and when that failed, Valen sought to destroy it, perhaps even to suppress the truth. But Vorelli's true composition was never meant to be heard. It was meant to be read by one person. And so he chose silence, I murmured, as a gift. Not a withdrawal, but an offering. Holmes gave a thin smile. Exactly. But what now? I asked. What becomes of Vorelli? Do we simply let him vanish into history? Holmes tapped the photo one last time. We let him finish his work. Artists like Vorelli don't vanish, Watson. They change forms. He has shed the stage. He will compose again, but quietly under another name, perhaps in another country, and Ada Rollins will know where to find him, if she hasn't already. I stared at him. And we allow it. We have no cause to stop it, Holmes said gently. No law broken now. Valen and his accomplice will answer for their crimes. The registry is safe. The secret has passed into hands not likely to abuse it. The rest is code. There was a silence between us then, one not of awkwardness but of resolution. The case, if not closed in the strictest sense, had reached the final bar, and Holmes, who so often seemed immune to beauty for its own sake, sat back in his chair with the faintest note of contentment on his features, like a conductor lowering his hands after the final chord has sounded. I looked again at the letter Vorelli had left. There is no encore, perhaps not. But there had been music, there had been mystery, and above all there had been a man who understood, better than most, that sometimes the greatest truths do not echo. They remain. The lamps outside flared to life as night took its rightful place above the rooftops of London. And in the stillness that followed, I swear I heard it, not a violin's cry, but the memory of one, played once and never again. The days that followed passed with an uncommon stillness. Holmes, for his part, allowed the matter of Luca Vorelli to settle into the back recesses of his mind. Like a book placed deliberately on the highest shelf, reachable should one ever need it again, but not to be reopened lightly, he filled the hours with a string of minor inquiries. A missing ledger from a solicitor's office in Holborn, the sudden vanishing of a Persian greyhound from a Belgravia mews. To the outside observer, these trifles would have seemed worlds apart from the intricacies of the Vorelli affair, and yet I knew better. Holmes was never more thoughtful than when pretending not to be. It was not until the fourth evening after our return from Hampstead that a new development arrived, one that would stir the dormant threads of the case and draw from Holmes a flicker of the intensity I had thought spent. It came, as so many of our pivotal messages did, by envelope delivered by a plain-faced boy just after supper, and addressed not to Holmes but to me. Unusual, Holmes murmured, eyeing it. You are not often the first name on a cryptic correspondence, Watson. Open it. I did. The paper inside was thick, faintly perfumed, and bore no letterhead. The handwriting was delicate, slanted, and unmistakably continental. Dr. Watson, I write not out of vanity, nor in guilt, but in gratitude. You and Mr. Holmes protected something I could not. The choice to remain unheard. I ask one last indulgence. Come tomorrow evening, alone, to the back hall of the Palais du Chant in Bloomsbury. Tell no one. Listen only. A.R. I read it twice, then passed it silently to Holmes. He took it without a word and read, his expression unreadable. Palais du Chant, he murmured. That's the private rehearsal space attached to the old French Opera Society. It hasn't been in regular use for years. He looked at me, not with surprise, but something closer to approval. So she plays her hand after all. You knew she would reach out? She had to. Artists live by performance. Watson, even if the audience is but one. He handed the letter back. You must go. Alone? Yes. If she wished me there, she would have said so. Besides, he added with a wry smile, you have an advantage I do not. You are trusted. I met his gaze. And if it's a trap, he gave a shrug that managed to be both nonchalant and deliberate. Then bring your revolver and trust your ear more than your eyes. The following evening, I did as instructed. I dressed plainly, tucked my service revolver into my coat, and set out for Bloomsbury beneath a sky pressed low with clouds. The Palais Duchamp stood at the end of a quiet street, its iron gates ajar and the front entrance dark, but around the side, as promised, a narrow corridor led to a back hall, whose door stood slightly open. Inside, the space was lit by a single lamp at the far end. Dust motes swirled in the shaft of light, giving the impression that the room itself breathed. Rows of wooden chairs were arrayed before a modest dais, and seated atop it, cello resting against her shoulder, was Ada Rollins. She did not look up as I entered. Her fingers were poised upon the strings, her eyes closed. Without preamble, she began to play. It was no composition I recognized. At first the notes were simple, isolated, like steps in snow. Then they grew warmer, textured, building in gentle waves. The piece was not melancholy, nor was it joyful. It was patient, as though waiting for something to return. There were gaps in the phrasing, rests, where one expected a swell, silences that carried more weight than any crescendo. But in those spaces I began to understand. This was not a song for the public. It was not a performance in the ordinary sense. It was a conversation, a continuation of something once begun between two people who understood music, not as ornament, but as language. When she finished, she let the bow fall gently against her knee and opened her eyes. "I knew you would come," she said. I stepped forward but remained a few feet away. "Why now?" She stood, returning the cello to its case. "Because I needed you to see what silence can contain." She nodded. "The final piece, not the manuscript you found. That was meant for others, to obscure, to distract. This was meant for..." She picked up a small envelope from the music stand and held it out. "He left this behind, said that if the truth ever became too heavy, I should pass it on. I think he knew you would carry it more honestly than most." I took it and unfolded the contents. It was a brief letter, dated 3 days before the recital he never attended. To Dr. Watson, "You are a man who watches genius without needing to control it. That is a rare thing. Holmes will understand the shape of what I've done, but not the weight. I have not disappeared. I have dispersed. That is a different matter. You will not find me, but know that I remain, in music, in her, in the notes that never resolve. Let silence be enough. Lael." I let the letter fall to my side. "He's alive then." She gave a faint smile. "He is what he chose to be. Isn't that life enough?" I could think of no reply. She moved to the doorway and opened it, gesturing gently. Our audience was over. As I walked back through the cool, quiet London streets, I replayed the melody again and again in my head. There had been no encore, no thunderous applause, just the memory of a few quiet notes, and the knowledge that somewhere, in the shadow between disappearance and peace, a man had composed his own ending, and played it only once. Back at Baker Street, Holmes looked up as I entered. I handed him the letter. He read it slowly, and then folded it with uncommon care. "Well?" he asked. "He's gone," I said, "but not lost." Holmes nodded. "That's the best anyone can be." And he turned back to the fire, saying no more. But in his silence I heard the faintest echo, perhaps the last note of Varelli's fugue, still resonating, not in the ear, but in the soul. The fire in our sitting room had burned low. By the time I finished recounting my evening to Holmes, he listened in his usual posture of still absorption, hands together, fingertips touching his lips, as if hearing the tale through the ears of someone 2 rooms removed. Only when I had spoken the final words, "not lost," did he lean back slightly and close his eyes. For a moment I thought he might remain silent, as he often did after a case's final resolution. But then he surprised me. "Do you know what it means, Watson?" he said, his voice lower than usual. "When a man removes himself so completely from the world, not out of fear nor shame, but with..." I considered. "It means he believes the world no longer needs him, or that he no longer needs it." Holmes opened his eyes again, and the lines around them seemed, for once, unguarded. "Yes, and yet the paradox persists. He leaves behind traces, manuscripts, instruments, messages, and in doing so, ensures that he is not in fact forgotten. He chose how to be remembered, I said. Holmes gave a brief nod, which is more than most of us ever manage. He stood and crossed the room, not to the window this time, but to the shelf where our case files were kept. He removed a fresh folder, marked it Violin, the silent fugue, and slipped within it the letter addressed to me. There, he said almost to himself. Let the silence remain intact. It might have ended there. Had things remained undisturbed, the matter might well have faded into legend, spoken of rarely as one of those curious affairs where no one truly wins and nothing is quite what it seems. But London, ever unwilling to rest upon a quiet note, did not permit it. The very next morning brought with it an article in the Daily Telegraph, buried well below the fold beneath notices of diplomatic shifts in Vienna and a minor coal strike in Durham. I nearly missed it myself until the mention of a familiar name made my eye pause. Unidentified composer, found dead in Swiss border town. I read the piece twice before looking up. Holmes. He had already retrieved his paper and was scanning the same article. His expression did not change, but he said he couldn't stay away from the borderlands. Domadesola is not a place one stumbles upon. It is a threshold between Italy and Switzerland, between countries, between endings and beginnings. You believe it's him? Holmes folded the paper with care. I believe it is what he wished us to find. The emphasis was deliberate. You think it's a second vanishing? I asked. Or a final disguise? Or a decoy? The body was unclaimed. The identity assumed. A man with no papers, only music. He tapped the page. Violin understood the power of narrative. He wrote not only in melody but in myth. A life unfinished must, by nature, complete itself. And Ada? I asked quietly. Holmes turned toward the fire again. She will not confirm it, nor will she deny it. She is now the sole keeper of the final composition, and of the truth, if there is one, and you're content to let it rest. Holmes stared into the flames. There are some puzzles, Watson, that are not meant to be solved but lived with, like an unresolved chord, suspended, and yet, even as he said it, I could see the restlessness return to him. Not dissatisfaction, but the whisper of an unsatisfied harmony in the far reaches of his mind. A sense that something, perhaps not a crime, but a truth, remained yet unrevealed. 3 days later he proved me right. It began with a parcel delivered without sender's name. It arrived in a plain wrapper, addressed to Holmes and bore a Milanese postmark. Inside was a slim lacquered box, no longer than a violin bow. When Holmes opened it, he found a sheaf of manuscript pages tied with silk ribbon, and beneath them, a single finely crafted tuning peg, bright yellow. No note, no name, no declaration. Holmes said nothing for a long while. Then he carried the manuscript to his desk, unrolled the ribbon, and examined the first page beneath his lens. It is his hand, he said softly, and the piece is new, untitled, but the structure is familiar. I stepped closer. A continuation, perhaps, or a counterpoint. A new voice answering the first. He played no part of it aloud. He merely read the score, eyes following every mark, every flourish, every carefully placed rest. At the end of the third page, he smiled. There is a pattern, he said. Every third note spells out a phrase in solfege. He took a pencil and with neat precision marked the hidden phrase in the margin. That evening, he sat with the yellow peg between his fingers, turning it slowly in the lamplight, as though listening for a sound it might still contain. And I understood then that while the rest of the world would remember Luca Violin as a vanished virtuoso, either lost to time or to the mountains, Holmes would remember him differently. Not as a mystery, but as a fellow composer of silence. And though the violin case had long since been closed, though the crypt was sealed and the registry hidden, the melody of that man's departure still echoed not in the concert halls of London, but here, between two chairs on Baker Street where sound and silence lived side by side. For even silence, I had learned, could carry a signature. And Holmes, better than anyone, knew how to read it. The final days of the case passed, not with crescendo, but with coda. The yellow tuning peg remained on Holmes's desk for nearly a week, nestled in a shallow porcelain dish he often used for tobacco ash. He never used it, nor did he enshrine it. It merely sat there, a mute artifact of a man who had chosen disappearance over applause. I once asked if he intended to send it back to Miss Rollins, and Holmes, without looking up from his microscope, had replied simply, "She already knows it was received." There was no need to return the gesture. The message had passed. The final bar had been played. Still, I found myself haunted by questions, not of guilt or uncertainty, but of something subtler, an unspoken knowledge Holmes had kept tucked behind his usual veil of precision. I saw it in his manner, the way he would revisit the manuscript late at night, the way he listened, more often than spoke, when the street outside grew quiet. The case was solved, yes, but not closed. Not entirely. And then, one morning in early December, Holmes did something utterly uncharacteristic. He invited Lestrade to tea. The inspector arrived looking more confused than ever. "Thought it might be about that break-in on Charing Cross," Lestrade said as he shrugged out of his coat. "Didn't expect cucumber sandwiches." Holmes poured him tea with solemn courtesy. "You've handled the violin matter competently. I wanted to thank you." Lestrade stared. "You? What?" "Your men secured the registry and the violin. Both are now with the Crown under proper seal. You correctly deduced that violin was motivated less by greed than by control, and you refrained, crucially, from pressing Miss Rollins after the conservatory visit." Lestrade, clearly unsettled, gave a non-committal grunt. Figured she'd had enough of questions. He opened a narrow drawer of the sideboard and withdrew a second violin peg, identical in color to the one already on his desk, but unmistakably older, worn smooth by long use. He laid it beside the first. Lestrade looked between them, baffled. "The truth," Holmes replied. "Varelli's disappearance was not to escape a crime, nor to bury a secret. It was to preserve something." He turned to me, and in his gaze I saw the moment coming, the one he had postponed, delayed, tucked away behind deductions and distractions. "Watson, do you remember the crypt beneath St. Paul's?" "Of course. And do you remember the parchment hidden within the yellow violin?" "There were two," he said quietly. The second, folded beneath the first, bore a different signature. Not Stradivari's, but Guarneri del Gazuzu's, another master luthier of Cremona. Varelli had found more than a single relic. He had uncovered the location of another hidden instrument, one that, by all rights, should not exist. Lestrade blinked. "Another violin." Holmes nodded. "One with a tuning system encoded entirely in quarter tones. Not playable in any Western orchestra. Not heard by the modern ear, but referenced in whispers among a secret society of musicians who believed that sound could influence memory and behavior. Violin was one of them. So was Varelli. But where Violin sought control, Varelli sought release. He let the silence settle. "The yellow violin was never the prize," Holmes said. "It was the mask, the misdirection. The true instrument was recovered a fortnight ago at a villa in the foothills of the Alps. Adada Rollins was seen entering the villa 3 nights later, and no one has seen her since." He turned to the fire. "She has taken his place, or joined him." Lestrade let out a low whistle. "And what do you want me to do with this information?" "Nothing," Holmes said. "You will do nothing, because there is no crime here, only choice. They chose silence over spectacle, truth over attention." He stood and brushed a crumb from his sleeve. "The case, as far as the Yard is concerned, is closed. The official version shall remain a brilliant musician disappeared before a final performance. 2 men were arrested for attempting to steal a priceless instrument. No body, no trial, no motive left to pursue." Lestrade looked as though he might protest. but then, perhaps out of fatigue or deeper understanding, simply nodded. "Well," he said, standing, "it's a damn strange one, Holmes, but I suppose some music's not meant to be danced to." "Precisely," Holmes murmured. When Lestrade had gone, Holmes returned to his desk, where the two yellow pegs now lay beside one another like matched bookends to an unwritten volume. "You knew almost from the start," I said. He looked at me then, not with triumph or smug satisfaction, but with something I could only describe as reverence, because even the sharpest mind must sometimes listen, not analyze. Varelli's case was not a crime, it was a composition. And like any true composition, it ends not with answers, but resonance. He reached for his own violin, tuned it in thoughtful silence, then drew the bow across the strings. The melody he played was unfamiliar, sparse, delicate, the same pattern I had heard at the Palais du Chant. But now, there were faint changes, variations so slight I might have missed them had I not stood beside him all these years. It was not Varelli's music alone anymore. Holmes had added something of himself to it, and I knew, as I had always known, that no man escapes the echo of brilliance, not even one who walks always 10 steps ahead of the world. For in that final note I heard not mystery, not melancholy. She nodded. "The final piece. Not the manuscript you found. That was meant for others to obscure, to distract. This was meant for me." She picked up a small envelope from the music stand and held it out. "He left this behind, said that if the truth ever became too heavy, I should pass it on. I think he knew you would carry it more honestly than most." I took it and unfolded the contents. It was a brief letter, dated 3 days before the recital he never attended. To Dr. Watson, "I have not disappeared. I have dispersed. That is a different matter. You will not find me, but know that I remain in music, in her, in the notes that never resolve." I let the letter fall to my side. "He's alive, then." She gave a faint smile. "He is what he chose to be. Isn't that life enough?" I could think of no reply. She moved to the doorway and opened it, gesturing gently. Our audience was over. As I walked back through the cool, quiet London streets, I replayed the melody again and again in my head. There had been no encore, no thunderous applause, just the memory of a few quiet notes, and the knowledge that somewhere, in the shadow between disappearance and peace, a man had composed his own ending and played it only once. Back at Baker Street, Holmes looked up as I entered. I handed him the letter. He read it slowly and then folded it with uncommon care. "Well?" he asked. "He's gone," I said, "but not lost." Holmes nodded. "That's the best anyone can be," and he turned back to the fire, saying no more. But in his silence, I heard the faintest echo, perhaps the last note of Varelli's fugue, still resonating, not in the ear, but in the soul. The fire in our sitting room had burned low by the time I finished recounting my evening to Holmes. He listened in his usual posture of still absorption, hands together, fingertips touching his lips, as if hearing the tale through the ears of someone 2 rooms removed. Only when I had spoken the final words, "not lost," did he lean back slightly and close his eyes. For a moment I thought he might remain silent, as he often did after a case's final resolution, but then he surprised me. "Do you know what it means, Watson?" he said, his voice lower than usual. "When a man removes himself so completely from the world, not out of fear, nor shame, but with," I considered, "it means he believes the world no longer needs him, or that he no longer needs it." Holmes opened his eyes again, and the lines around them seemed, for once, unguarded. Yes, and yet the paradox persists. He leaves behind traces, manuscripts, instruments, messages, and in doing so ensures that he is not in fact forgotten. He chose how to be remembered, I said. Holmes gave a brief nod, which is more than most of us ever manage. He stood and crossed the room, not to the window this time, but to the shelf where our case files were kept. He removed a fresh folder, marked it Varelli, the silent fugue, and slipped within it the letter addressed to me. "There," he said, almost to himself. Let the silence remain intact. It might have ended there. Had things remained undisturbed, the matter might well have faded into legend, spoken of rarely, as one of those curious affairs where no one truly wins and nothing is quite what it seems. But London, ever unwilling to rest upon a quiet note, did not permit it. The very next morning brought with it an article in the Daily Telegraph. Buried well below the fold, beneath notices of diplomatic shifts in Vienna and a minor coal strike in Durham, I nearly missed it myself until the mention of a familiar name made my eye pause. Unidentified composer, found dead in Swiss border town. Local authorities in Domodossola report the discovery of a body believed to be that of a reclusive composer known locally as Signore Luca. Though no passport was found, a small trunk bearing sheet music and a violin case was recovered nearby. The deceased was discovered at the base of a rocky outcrop near a known mountain pass. Cause of death: apparent fall. Foul play not suspected. I read the piece twice before looking up. Holmes. He had already retrieved his paper and was scanning the same article. His expression did not change, but he said he couldn't stay away from the borderlands. Domodossola is not a place one stumbles upon. It is a threshold between Italy and Switzerland, between countries, between endings and beginnings. You believe it's him? Holmes folded the paper with care. I believe it is what he wished us to find. The emphasis was deliberate. You think it's a second vanishing? I asked. Or a final disguise? Or a decoy? The body was unclaimed, the identity assumed. A man with no papers, only music. He tapped the page. They rarely understood the power of narrative. He wrote not only in melody but in myth. A life unfinished must, by nature, complete itself. And Ada? I asked quietly. Holmes turned toward the fire again. She will not confirm it, nor will she deny it. She is now the sole keeper of the final composition and of the truth, if there is one, and you're content to let it rest. Holmes stared into the flames. There are some puzzles, Watson, that are not meant to be solved, but lived with, like an unresolved chord, suspended. 3 days later, he proved me right. It began with a parcel delivered without sender's name. It arrived in a plain wrapper, addressed to Holmes, and bore a Milanese postmark. Inside was a slim, lacquered box, no longer than a violin bow. No note, no name, no declaration. Holmes said nothing for a long while. Then he carried the manuscript to his desk, unrolled the ribbon, and examined the first page beneath his lens. It is his hand, he said softly, and the piece is new, untitled. But the structure is familiar. I stepped closer. A continuation. He played no part of it aloud. He merely read the score, eyes following every mark, every flourish, every carefully placed rest. At the end of the third page, he smiled. There is a pattern, he said. Every third note spells out a phrase in solfege. He took a pencil and, with neat precision, marked the hidden phrase in the margin. Non sono mai partito. I was never gone. I translated aloud. Holmes looked up at me. The fugue never ended, Watson. It merely changed tempo. That evening, he sat with the yellow peg between his fingers, turning it slowly in the lamplight, as though listening for a sound it might still contain. And I understood then that while the rest of the world would remember Luca Virelli as a vanished virtuoso, either lost to time or to the mountains, Holmes would remember him differently, not as a mystery. And though the violin case had long since been closed, though the crypt was sealed and the registry hidden, the melody of that man's departure still echoed, not in the concert halls of London, but here between two chairs on Baker Street, where sound and silence lived side by side. For even silence, I had learned, could carry a signature, and Holmes, better than anyone, knew how to read it. The final days of the case passed, not with crescendo, but with coda. The yellow tuning peg remained on Holmes's desk for nearly a week. nestled in a shallow porcelain dish he often used for tobacco ash. He never used it, nor did he enshrine it. It merely sat there, a mute artifact of a man who had chosen disappearance over applause. I once asked if he intended to send it back to Miss Rollins, and Holmes, without looking up from his microscope, had replied simply, "She already knows it was received." There was no need to return the gesture. The message had passed. The final bar had been played. Still, I found myself haunted by questions. Not of guilt or uncertainty, but of something subtler, an unspoken knowledge. Holmes had kept tucked behind his usual veil of precision. I saw it in his manner. The way he would revisit the manuscript late at night, the way he listened, more often than spoke. When the street outside grew quiet, the case was solved, yes, but not closed, not entirely. And then one morning in early December, Holmes did something utterly uncharacteristic. He invited Lestrade to tea. The inspector arrived looking more confused than ever. "Thought it might be about that break-in on Charing Cross," Lestrade said as he shrugged out of his coat. "Didn't expect cucumber sandwiches." Holmes poured him tea with solemn courtesy. "You've handled the violin matter competently. I wanted to thank you." Lestrade stared. "You? What?" "Your men secured the registry and the violin. Both are now with the Crown under proper seal. You correctly deduced that violin was motivated less by greed than by control, and you refrained, crucially, from pressing Miss Rollins after the conservatory visit." Lestrade, clearly unsettled, gave a non-committal grunt. "Figured she'd had enough of question." Holmes leaned forward. "Then permit me one last revelation, Inspector, in the spirit of resolution." He opened a narrow drawer of the sideboard and withdrew a second violin peg, identical in color to the one already on his desk, but unmistakably older, worn smooth by long use. He laid it beside the first. Lestrade looked between them, baffled. "What am I seeing?" "The truth," Holmes replied. "Varelli's disappearance was not to escape a crime, nor to bury a secret. It was to preserve something." He turned to me, and in his gaze I saw the moment coming. The one he had postponed, delayed, tucked away behind deductions and distractions. "Watson, do you remember the crypt beneath St. Paul's?" "Of course." "And do you remember the parchment hidden within the yellow violin?" I nodded. "There were two," he said quietly. The second, folded beneath the first, bore a different signature. Not Stradivari's, but Guarneri del Gazzuzzo's, another master luthier of Cremona. Varelli had found more than a single relic. He had uncovered the location of another hidden instrument, one that by all rights should not exist. Lestrade blinked. "Another violin?" Holmes nodded. "One with a tuning system encoded entirely in quarter tones, not playable in any Western orchestra, not heard by the modern ear, but referenced in whispers among a secret society of musicians who believed that sound could influence memory and behavior. Violin was one of them. So was Varelli. But where Violin sought control, Varelli sought release. He let the silence settle. The yellow violin was never the prize, Holmes said. It was the mask, the misdirection. The true instrument was recovered a fortnight ago, at a villa in the foothills of the Alps. Ada Rollins was seen entering the villa 3 nights later, and no one has seen her since. He turned to the fire. She has taken his place, or joined him. Lestrade let out a low whistle. "And what do you want me to do with this information?" "Nothing," Holmes said. "You will do nothing, because there is no crime here, only choice." They chose silence over spectacle, truth over attention. He stood and brushed a crumb from his sleeve. "The case, as far as the yard is concerned, is closed. The official version shall remain. A brilliant musician disappeared before a final performance. 2 men were arrested for attempting to steal a priceless instrument. No body, no trial, no motive left to pursue." Lestrade looked as though he might protest, but then, perhaps out of fatigue or deeper understanding, simply nodded. "Well," he said, standing, "it's a damn strange one, Holmes, but I suppose some music's not meant to be danced to." "Precisely," Holmes murmured. When Lestrade had gone, Holmes returned to his desk, where the two yellow pegs now lay beside one another like matched bookends to an unwritten volume. "You knew almost from the start," I said. "I suspected," he replied, "but I needed the composition to play out in full." "Why?" He looked at me then, not with triumph or smug satisfaction, but with something I could only describe as reverence. "Because even the sharpest mind must sometimes listen, not analyze. Varelli's case was not a crime. It was a composition, and like any true composition, it ends not with answers, but resonant." He reached for his own violin, tuned it in thoughtful silence, then drew the bow across the strings. The melody he played was unfamiliar, sparse, delicate, the same pattern I had heard at the Palais du Chant. But now, there were faint changes, variations so slight I might have missed them, had I not stood beside him all these years. It was not Varelli's music alone anymore. Holmes had added something of himself to it. When the final note faded, he let the bow fall and closed his eyes. And I knew, as I had always known, that no man escapes the echo of brilliance, not even one who walks always 10 steps ahead of the world. For in that final note, I heard not mystery, not melancholy, but peace. And in Holmes's stillness I saw that he had heard it too.